Next, we have Matthew Loberg. He's calling from Minneapolis and he's talking about using Amazon Web Services to deploy blazing fast websites, a topic that is essential to any static
All
website.
right. So today I'm going to talk about deploying Jekyll to AWS. Um, this is me. Uh, so some background on my history with Jekyll. I transitioned to Jekyll from a WordPress website in 2011, and that MLO.io is a Jekyll site. When I transitioned, I started using GitHub Pages because it was, easy, free, um, and allowed me to set up my website very quickly. In 2014, I was looking for a job, and the week I sent out my resume, Jekyll or GitHub Pages had a bunch of issues, and so I was getting constantly pinged from my website watching service that my site was down, and it would be down for hours at a time. And because a lot of my work was hosted on my site, I needed to get it back up quickly and to something that would, be up. So I moved to just hosting on S3 and then adding a DNS record to point it at the S3 bucket. Then in 2016, I wanted to add SSL to my site because sites should have SSL. Chrome was going to start dinging you if you didn't have SSL, your SEO would go down, whatever. And so I set up CloudFront and used the Let's Encrypt certificate, and I saw my website speeds go up a little bit because of CloudFront, and then it was using SSL, which is nice. But then when the Let's Encrypt certificate expired, I had some issues getting that back, and so I moved to using AWS Certification Manager, which we'll go over how to use that. So I am a principal software engineer at Nerdery. We're a digital business consultancy. We're headquartered in Minneapolis, Chicago, and Phoenix, and we are hiring, though I don't think we do a lot of Jekyll. We do use Jekyll for internal sites, and we have used other static website generators for other clients, but Jekyll is not something we tend to use a ton of. So why AWS? So looking at some performance stats for my personal website, that MLO.io, you can see that I get page load times if it's not on the node, if it's not on the CloudFront Edge node, in 0.7 seconds to a second, and if it is on the node, between 200 and 300 milliseconds. So that's some very fast load times. It also has a lot of uptime. So I've been notified that my website has been down twice. Once was from the Let's Encrypt certificate, and the other one was from a domain registrar issue. So nothing related to AWS. And the nice thing is, if AWS goes down, you're not going to be the only one who's down. So hosting your website on AWS. And then it's been allowed me to have some customizability in what I do with my website. So I just upgraded to Jekyll for this week. If I was on GitHub Pages, I'm pretty limited in what versions I can run. And I can also utilize custom plugins, which I have one that allows me to pull assets from a manifest JSON file. So I use Webpack to build all my assets. And then the cost to all this isn't actually that bad. I'm using a bunch of these AWS services, but at the end of the day, my entire AWS bill is $1.90, and most of that is from Route 53 or their DNS service. So under $2 a month for a site that performs like this, isn't too bad. So I was gonna do a live coding of this, but when I demoed it this week, some things on AWS take a couple minutes, so I just took screenshots as I set it up. I'm going to walk through the using the AWS console because it's something that is easy to approach, but I've also provided CLI commands if that's more your thing, or if you want to start to automate adding new sites, you can do that through their CLI or API. So for this first step, we need to create a bucket. And the name generally should match what your website is. And so for this demo, I created a quick website for my band. So I gave it the same name as the domain I'd registered, so idestroyedmusic.com, and then I just accepted the defaults and hit create. If you're doing this through the CLI, use the S3 API create bucket command. And next, we need to add a bucket policy. So due to all the security issues that have happened around S3, public access is turned off by default. And they also added additional settings to prevent this from, prevent files from becoming public. So the first thing, we need to add this bucket policy, and what this allows is anyone can read or can get an object from this bucket, and you can see the resource reference here. The bucket name / and then star for any object or any file within that bucket. So through the console, you need to go to the permissions tab, hit block public access, edit it, and then turn all of those off. Now this will allow files in your bucket to be publicly accessed, so make sure you're not putting sensitive information in there. Anything that is in here will be can be publicly read. And then we're just adding that policy that allows anyone to read any object. And we need this because we're hosting files for a website here. And then if you're doing this from the command line, just use the put bucket policy and then create a JSON file with that same policy and then upload it. Next, we need to add our website configuration. In the console, this is under the properties tab. And here we're saying use this bucket as a website. We need to say what our index is, in this case, index.html, what the error document is. So if it doesn't find the file, and I use the Jekyll default of 404.html, and then just hit save. If you're doing this from the command line, AWS S3 website, the S3 path of the bucket, and then those options. And then finally, we need to upload our website. So after you do a Jekyll build, you can do this through the command line. I prefer to do this through the, you can do this through the console. I prefer to do this through the command line because it is a little bit easier than dragging and dropping a bunch of files. So this is saying from my local _site directory, upload it to the S3 idestroyedmusic.com bucket. And if we go to the domain that was on the static website configuration page, you get your static website. So easy as that. If you're doing internal documentation sites or something that doesn't need a friendly URL, you can call it done right here. But this probably isn't the case, and we'll want to get into a little bit more advanced of a setup. So if you want to add HTTPS support, improve the speed of your site, or have more customability options, we need to set up CloudFront. But before we set up CloudFront, we need to set up Route 53. So Route 53 is Amazon's DNS service, and this is going to be the biggest cost. It costs 50 cents a month per hosted zone or domain name. But if you're using Route 53, it makes a lot of the other integrations with CloudFront and S3 a lot easier. So I would definitely recommend using Route 53. So we're going to set up a new hosted zone, in this case, the domain you registered. And they'll give you some DNS servers. Make sure on your domain name registrar, you're updating the name servers to be what Amazon gives you. If you're using the command line, you also need to pass this caller reference, which is a unique string, and that prevents duplicate requests going into Amazon. Next, we need to create an SSL certificate. Now we're going to use Amazon Certificate Manager, or ACM. For public SSL certs, this is free, so this doesn't cost me anything. I just request one for a domain name. I can add additional subdomains, and then you do need to validate it either through a DNS record or through email. I chose DNS because there's a nice little button once you request the certificate to add those DNS records to Route 53. And this does take, some time for the DNS routes to propagate, and so it took me about 5 or 10 minutes when I set it up this week. If you're using command line, here you can see I'm also adding an additional star.idestroy.com. So if I have any subdomains, they'll also be covered by the same certificate. Next, we need to create a CloudFront distribution. Now there's a lot of configuration options in here. So it's easy to get overwhelmed, but the important ones are going to be the origin settings. And if you click into the origin domain name, it'll actually drop down S3 buckets that you have configured for public access. So just select yours from in there. And then in the redirect settings, I chose to redirect HTTP to HTTPS since I am setting up that SSL cert. And then selecting the ACM certificate that I just created. And then in the CNAME settings, make sure you're adding your domain name. And if you want to go ahead and tweak the rest of the settings, feel free to do that. But I found that other than the ones I mentioned, the default work pretty well. If you're doing this through the command line, it's going to be a little bit more difficult because you need to figure out what that distribution config looks like. It's a JSON file again. And the AWS CLI documentation has more details on that. Or you could also create one, get the config using the API, and then just update it for the additional sites that you're setting up. And then finally, the last step is adding a Route 53 record. So if we go in there, hit create record set, and then hit alias, it'll actually, again, give us a list of S3 buckets that we can configure or CloudFront distributions. So this makes it really easy. And then the rest of the defaults are fine. And then once we hit create and wait a couple minutes, here's the CLI command for that. We'll have a website. One thing to note, the CloudFront distribution creation can take a while. It took, I think setting it up this week took over a half hour. So which is why I decided not to live code this, because that would have been the majority of my time. So now that we have a website set up, how do we manage deployments? Well, we can just run that S3 sync or re-upload files to S3, and then we also need to create a CloudFront invalidation. So CloudFront invalidation tells all of the CloudFront edge nodes with a copy to delete the copy, and the next request fetch it from the origin, fetch it from S3. Here you can specify individual files that have changed, or in this case, just use a /star. If you're doing a lot of CloudFront invalidations, that can also run up your bills. So if you stick with just /star, that's going to be your best option for managing your AWS bill. And so every time you need to do a deploy, just run these two things. Doing it through the console is kind of cumbersome, so I'd recommend automating in some sort of fashion. And I would also recommend creating an IAM user just for deployments, so you're not opening yourself up to security risks. So here's a policy, an IAM policy that allows me to deploy to S3 and only to that bucket, and then also just create an invalidation. And I would attach this to user with just these permissions. And then anytime you need to do a deploy, use that user credential instead. And then beyond that, automate with continuous integration. One of the nice things about GitHub Pages was anytime you pushed, it would rebuild your site and be there in a couple minutes. And with continuous integration, you don't need to lose that. You set up your config. In this case, I'm using Circle. And you can see a link down to my current Circle configuration, so go check that out. But I'm doing just a Jekyll build and then doing a sync and a invalidate. And every time I push to master, my site just automatically gets deployed. All right, so tips and tricks that I've learned throughout using Jekyll and AWS. First, redirect your www to non-www, or reverse if you prefer to have the www subdomain. And that's really easy. You just create another bucket. And in this case, I created the bucket www.idestroymusic.com, and then just redirected my request to my domain name, and then hit save. And then over in Route 53, add a new record set of www, and then hit alias. And then again, the alias target will give you a bunch of drop downs to all your buckets. So just select the new one you created, hit create, and now redirects are happening. And then add caching. So you can configure caching directly on the CloudFront settings. So you can say, by default, I want a cache of a week. Or you can, by default, we'll just use the cache configuration from the origin or from S3. And so when you do that, add your cache headers to when you upload. In this case, it's just a cache control. In this case, I'm saying cache it add a cache header of a week. And then I'm also saying reduced redundancy, because I don't care if if I lose these files, it's not a huge deal. I can just re-upload the site. And then add caches to images or things that never change. And so let's say we want to just do that right now. We can copy all the files from one folder back to the same folder, and then set the cache control. To this case, I think like a year is what that is. And something I do on my personal site is I use hashed file names to create. So when my CSS and JS files are built, it runs through Webpack, which adds the hash. and then I can use the same type of command, but instead of images, do assets. And so every time I do a deploy, I don't have to worry about invalidating my CSS caches or my JavaScript caches. If the file changed, there's a new file there. And that's all I had. So I'm Loberg on Twitter. If you had any questions, you can see my site, which I'll be posting a link to this slide and some resources. And actually, I'm going to do this right after this. Is I'm going to deploy my site and watch it run through Circle. And also, all the code for my site is public on GitHub, mlo.io. So you can see my Circle config. You can see how I'm doing things. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, that was great. I think it really just highlights the quality of hosting providers you can get for static websites. Because if you were spending $2 or $3 a month on WordPress hosting, it's probably not going to have 100% uptime, and it's likely you'll just be on a shared server with 100 other WordPress users.
Yeah, and I mean, AWS isn't the only option out there. I chose AWS because that's what I work in. I'm an AWS certified professional, but I know there's like Netlify, there's Cloud Cannon, like there's a bunch of different options when it comes to ways to host your static sites.
Sure. And I haven't actually used this, but have you heard of AWS Amplify?
I have not.
I think it's like their static. It's not clear whether it's static sites or just like maybe single page apps. Yeah, for hosting that. Yeah, I probably need to look into it more. But
AWS Amplify?
Yeah, it looks like kind of an all-in-one service for that sort of website. Yeah, I had a question on what was your trigger from switching from WordPress to Jekyll? Like, what was the last straw where?
It just like it didn't make sense because I wasn't updating it a lot.
Yeah.
Like, and just I didn't need a WYSIWYG because I could write everything in Markdown.
Sure.
And just managing a server sucks.
Yeah.
And so, by moving to S3, I don't have any servers to manage. My monthly bill is, was super small. And yeah, I just didn't need everything that that WordPress was giving me.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, nice. It's already deployed.
Yep.
Perfect.
And that all happened through Circle CI automatically. As soon as I pushed the master, it deployed it, and yeah.
That's great. Yeah, having that automated is the key. It's just magic.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Matthew.
Yeah,
it was a great talk, really insightful.